So the last contract we would need to talk about for a little bit is this option to buy. And y'all, real quick, let me kind of give you some idea if you're not familiar with this type of contract or heard of it before, but exactly what is it? But it's really kind of what it sounds like. It's an option to buy, where basically the buyer is requesting from the seller the option to buy. Now, again, this is a written agreement. We're getting ready to go over that, but it's a written agreement where basically the buyer is saying, I may want to buy it, I may not want to buy it. But if I do buy it, then here's the term. I'll pay this amount, and whatever the terms of the sale would be would also be included. Now, the problem is if the seller agrees to this option, then they got to hold that property for whatever that specified amount of time is in the contract that allows the buyer the option to buy, right? So, for example, they might have 6 months. They might have a 6-month option to buy. So the buyer could buy that property anytime within that 6-month period, or they may choose or opt not to buy it at all. But during that 6 months, seller, you cannot do anything with that property until that option period has expired. Now, why would a seller even agree to something like that? Well, we're going to talk about it. But I just want to make sure you had at least some basic understanding of what we're dealing with here when it comes to an option to buy. So, first of all, here's this OR and EE again. The optionor, which obviously is the seller, and the optionee is the buyer. So when you have an option to buy, assuming the buyer opts to buy, seller, you must sell. Okay? So the buyer has the option to buy or not buy. But under this agreement, if they opt to buy, seller must sell. So there's no option for the seller, but there is an option for the buyer. Why is that important? Because there's only one party at this point that's bound to this contract, and that's the seller. The seller is obligated under this contract. The buyer is not. Again, they have the option. So because you only have one party that's currently bound to this contract, then what kind of contract would an option to buy be? That's a unilateral contract. Remember, uni means one. So an option to buy is considered a unilateral contract, because there's only one party that's bound to the contract. Now, when we enter into this option to buy, you'll see here where the buyer acquires no interest in land. You do not own any interest. If you recall from an earlier discussion, I made the comment that with a typical sales contract, when a buyer makes an offer and the seller accepts the offer, at the time the offer is accepted, then that conveys equitable title to the buyer, right? They get equitable title because you got to have equitable title in order to get legal title. Now, you don't get the legal title until you close. But at the time the contract is agreed upon, equitable title is conveyed to that buyer at that time. Well, with an option to buy, because it's a unilateral contract, the other contract is bilateral, right? Because you got a buyer promising to buy and the seller promises to sell. That's a bilateral contract, and when that's accepted, equitable title conveys to the buyer. But with unilateral, equitable title or any other or no other interest will convey to the buyer. So the buyer does not own any interest at all in the property during the time of the option to buy. But what the buyer does get is some period of time in which they could choose or opt to buy. Again, that period of time, that's up to the parties. That's negotiable. It might be a 1 month option, might be a 6 month option, might be a year option, might be a 5 year option, whatever. So there's no set amount of time you get with an option to buy. It's just whatever amount of time both the buyer and the seller agree to. But any time within that period that's been identified, the buyer does have the right to buy the property at any time or walk away at any time. But y'all say it was a 1 year option. Seller, you cannot do anything with that property for that year because the buyer may choose to buy it, so you cannot do anything with it until that option period has expired. Okay? So we look at some other requirements of this option to buy. And then, obviously we have to include or identify all the terms of the sale, all the terms that would be included into the sale of this property. So in essence, what happens is this. You'll take a contract of sale and just fill it out. Y'all fill out the entire contract of sale. The only item that's left blank is the closing date. You won't fill that out because obviously at this moment, we don't even know if it will close because we don't know if the buyer will opt to buy or not. So you have to leave the closing date blank for the time being. But all the other terms have been agreed to, sales price and whatnot. And then basically the contract of sale becomes an addendum to the option to buy. The option to buy is like one sheet of paper usually, maybe two depending on which one you're using. But usually it's like one sheet of paper because there's not a whole lot to an option to buy. But what must be included in that option to buy agreement? Well, there's at a minimum 3 dates that must be agreed upon. Typically there's going to be more than this. But these are the 3 at a minimum, mandatory dates that must be agreed upon. The first date is what date was the contract ratified? This contract of sale where you agreed to all the terms and conditions. We have to agree on those terms, and whatever date that was, that will be entered into the option to buy. The second date is, how long will the buyer have the option to buy? Again, a month, 6 months, whatever it is, that must be identified in the option. It's considered the option period. How long does the buyer have the option to buy? And then the third date that must be included is, from the moment the buyer opts to buy. Once they say, all right, I'm buying. How many days does the buyer have from that point before they must close? 30 days, 45 days, whatever the case may be. But those 3 dates at a minimum must be included in the option to buy. Then here it says consideration is essential with an option to buy. First of all, what is consideration? Remember we were talking about it again previously. Consideration could be considered valuable consideration or invaluable. Well, when it comes to, let me back up. Remember, valuable consideration is some amount of money, price paid. Invaluable means love and affection, right? Hopefully you remember that. Well, the consideration we're talking about under an option to buy is valuable consideration. There is no invaluable or love and affection that would apply here. In other words, what they're saying, the buyer must put up some amount of money. This is the consideration at the time the option to buy is agreed to. Now, how much money they put up, again, that's negotiable. There's no set amount. but the buyer must put up some amount of valuable consideration or money at the time they agree to the option to buy. Y'all, otherwise the option contract is void. Y'all, you cannot have an option to buy without the buyer putting up some amount of money. And it's usually quite a bit of money. Y'all, several $1,000s, be my guess. But y'all, we were saying earlier, y'all, why would a seller even consider agreeing to an option to buy? This is why, y'all, because of this valuable consideration. But y'all, let's just say the consideration the buyer and seller agreed to was, say, $10,000. Buyer, whatever amount you put up, in this case $10,000, you will not get that money back. That's going to the seller. So in exchange for the $10,000 in consideration, then I'll give you 6 months option to buy, or a year, y'all, again, whatever amount of time they want to agree to. But y'all, some amount of money has to be put up by the buyer, again, at the time they agree to the option. Now, actually, let me back up here a little bit. We need to talk more about this consideration. So, y'all, in this example, we were using $10,000. The question might be now, y'all, obviously, if the buyer opts not to buy, then they've lost that money. It's gone. The seller now owns it. But what if the buyer opts to buy? The question now is, will that $10,000 they've already paid, will that be applied towards the purchase price, or will that be over and above the purchase price? I will tell you, it can be either way. Again, it's whatever the two parties agree to. But whatever they agree to, again, that must be specified in the option. Whether it will be applied towards the purchase price or this is over and above the purchase price. That has to be included. Now, y'all, assuming the buyer opts to buy, y'all, it means they've exercised their right to buy. Y'all, at that moment, now the buyer is obligated to buy. So now you have two parties. The seller is already under obligation to sell, and now the buyer is now under obligation to buy. So we have two parties obligated under the contract. So what kind of contract is it now? Now it's considered bilateral. Y'all be careful with this on the exam and for real world purposes for that matter. Y'all, if they ask you what type of contract is an option to buy, it's a unilateral contract. But if they state in the question what type of contract is an option to buy after the buyer has opted to buy or has exercised their option to buy, then at that point it's bilateral. But y'all, if it doesn't state in the question that the buyer has exercised their option to buy, then it's unilateral. It's unilateral contract, okay? But once it becomes a bilateral contract, y'all, obviously now the buyer will receive equitable title and can now prepare to close and hopefully get legal title once they close, okay? So that's the option to buy. Y'all, last thing I just want to touch on real quick. Y'all, you'll see where it lists what we call other types of contracts. Y'all, the only thing we want to make you aware of here is, y'all, there are different types of contracts depending on the type of property you're dealing with. If you want to embarrass yourself significantly, use the wrong contract for the type of property you're trying to buy and or sell. But y'all, we have contracts for brand new homes. We have different contracts for previously occupied or lived in homes. We have different contracts if it's a commercial property versus residential. There are different contracts for mobile homes. There are different contracts for land, just vacant land. If you don't use the right contract that goes with the type of property you're conveying, you're not going to have the legal provisions necessary to enforce the contract. So just be careful of that. Just make sure you're using the right type of contract for the type of property you're trying to convey. Okay? So there's your contracts. Y'all, hopefully that makes sense to you.